The courtroom was quiet in that heavy, expectant way that made every breath sound louder than it should. People sat forward in their seats, sensing something unusual was about to happen. At the center of it all stood a well-dressed woman, confident, composed, and visibly irritated that she even had to be there. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't apologetic. She was prepared to win. She lifted her phone slightly, her voice calm but sharp, and said something that made several heads turn. She wasn't asking for mercy. She wasn't explaining her situation. She was calling someone powerful, someone important, someone she clearly believed could end this entire situation in seconds. When she mentioned her husband's position, a low murmur rippled through the room. A governor. The word alone seemed to change the air. A few people exchanged uneasy glances, as if they just realized this case was never meant to be ordinary. Confidence crept into her posture as she waited, convinced that authority outside the room would overpower anything inside it. Behind the bench, Judge Frank Caprio watched quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react the way many expected. No raised eyebrow. No sarprivyuk. Just calm attention, as if he were listening not only to her words, but to the belief behind them. The belief that power bends rules. That connections rewrite consequences. When the call connected, the tension reached its breaking point. This was the moment everything could tilt in her favor, or collapse entirely. No one in the room spoke. No one dare move. Even the attorneys seemed unsure of what would happen next. Then Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly and made a simple request that no one saw coming. A request so unexpected that it froze the room even more than the phone call itself. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic in the usual sense. But within moments, it became painfully clear that this wasn't about titles, influence, or intimidation anymore. It was about something far more powerful. And the lesson that followed would leave everyone in that room silent. The courtroom was already tense when the clerk called the next case. People shifted in their seats, murmurs faded, and all eyes turned forward as Judge Frank Caprio adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file in front of him. He had seen thousands of cases over the years, but experience had taught him one thing above all else. The loudest stories were often hidden behind calm faces and confident words. Standing at the podium was Emily Reynolds, a well-dressed woman in her early 30s. Her posture was straight, her chin lifted slightly, and her expression carried a quiet confidence. She wasn't nervous like most people who stood in that spot. If anything, she looked prepared, almost rehearsed. In her hand was a sleek smartphone, and on her wrist, an expensive watch caught the light as she moved. Emily wasn't alone. Sitting in the front row of the gallery was her attorney, Michael Reynolds, a seasoned legal professional with decades of courtroom experience. More importantly, he was also her husband, a powerful state governor whose name carried weight far beyond the walls of this room. Though he wasn't beside her at the podium, his presence seemed to linger in every confident breath she took. Judge Caprio glanced up at Emily and spoke calmly, asking her to explain the situation that had brought her here today. Emily responded quickly, her voice smooth and controlled. She cited procedures, referenced statutes, and framed her explanation with legal language that sounded more like an argument than an explanation. It was clear she knew exactly how to speak the language of the law. As she spoke, the courtroom listened closely. Some were impressed. Others were confused. This wasn't the voice of someone overwhelmed by circumstance. This was the voice of someone accustomed to being heard, protected by influence and position. Judge Caprio listened without interruption. His face remained gentle, unreadable, but his eyes never left Emily. He wasn't focused on the words alone. He watched how she avoided certain details, how she rushed through moments that mattered, how confidence replaced clarity. When she finished, she paused, almost expectant, as if waiting for the judge to acknowledge her legal reasoning. The room fell silent. Papers stopped rustling. Even the bailiff shifted his stance. Judge Caprio leaned back slightly in his chair. He had heard polished arguments before. He had seen power try to disguise itself as precision. And he knew that when someone relied too heavily on words, it was often because they were afraid of what honesty might reveal. This wasn't just about a case. It was about influence, entitlement, and a belief that the law could be managed with the right connections. And Judge Caprio, with decades of wisdom behind him, was about to guide this courtroom towards something far more important than legal technicalities: the truth. The atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift the moment the proceedings officially started. What at first felt like a routine case now carried a quiet tension, as if everyone sensed something deeper was about to surface. The woman standing before the bench, Emily Reynolds, held her phone tightly in her hand, her confidence wavering just enough to reveal uncertainty beneath her composed exterior. Emily straightened her posture and spoke clearly, her tone sharp with entitlement rather than fear. She referenced statutes, procedural rights, and technicalities with practiced ease, each sentence carefully chosen to sound authoritative. It was obvious she had spent years around legal power. Her words flowed quickly, almost rehearsed, as if she believed the complexity itself would protect her. Judge Frank Caprio listened without interruption. His eyes remained calm but observant. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands, allowing her to finish without resistance. When she paused, waiting for acknowledgement, the silence in the room stretched longer than expected. The prosecutor, Michael Torres, shifted uncomfortably. He attempted to redirect the discussion back to the facts of the case, explaining the violation in simple terms. But Emily cut in again, correcting him, challenging his interpretation, and asserting that the matter was being mishandled. Her confidence grew with each interruption. She reminded the court of her connections, carefully avoiding direct threats, but making sure her influence was understood. Then she delivered the line that changed the energy completely. She calmly stated that her husband was the sitting governor of the state. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Heads turned. A few people exchanged glances, unsure whether they had heard correctly. Emily stood taller now, as if the words themselves had given her strength. She explained that she had already spoken to him, that he was aware of the situation, and that any further action could be considered unnecessary embarrassment for everyone involved. The implication was clear. This case, she believed, should not continue. Judge Caprio's expression did not change, but his gaze sharpened. He asked a simple question about the phone in her hand. Emily hesitated for a brief moment before answering that she could call her husband immediately if needed. The courtroom went still. Rather than reacting with anger or offense, the judge nodded slowly. He asked her to go ahead and make the call. Emily appeared surprised, but quickly masked it with a small, confident smile. She dialed the number and placed the phone to her ear, glancing around as if expecting the room to bend in her favor. When the call connected, she spoke softly at first, explaining where she was and what was happening. She then held the phone slightly away, assuming the conversation would remain private. Judge Caprio gently asked her to place the call on speaker. The request landed heavily. Emily froze. The audience leaned forward. The prosecutor looked up in disbelief. For the first time, hesitation crossed her face. She tried to object, suggesting it wasn't appropriate. But the judge calmly reminded her that transparency was important, especially when influence was being implied in open court. After a long pause, Emily complied. The voice on the other end filled the courtroom. Confident, authoritative, familiar to many who recognized it from television and public addresses. The governor asked what the issue was, his tone firm, expecting resolution. Emily began explaining, framing herself as a victim of unnecessary procedure. She emphasized her embarrassment, her status, and the inconvenience of the situation. She waited, almost smiling, for reassurance. Judge Caprio listened carefully to every word, his eyes fixed not on the phone, but on Emily herself. When she finished, the judge finally spoke, addressing the governor directly, his voice calm and respectful. He explained that this was a courtroom, not a political office, that every person standing before him deserved equal treatment, and that invoking power to bypass responsibility only raised deeper concerns. The silence that followed was heavy. The governor's voice changed. Gone was the authority. In its place was hesitation. He acknowledged the judge respectfully, stating that the matter should be handled according to the law, without special treatment. Emily's confidence cracked. The room seemed to exhale all at once. The power she thought she held had dissolved, replaced by something she had never expected to face in public: accountability. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his expression still gentle, but now unmistakably firm. The real lesson, it seemed, was only beginning. The courtroom had reached a strange stillness, the kind that comes when tension has nowhere left to climb. Emily Reynolds stood frozen at the podium, her phone still in her hand, her confidence drained away. The voice of her husband, Governor Michael Reynolds, lingered in everyone's mind, sharp and dismissive, as if power alone could bend reality. Judge Frank Caprio did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together, studying Emily with a look that was calm, patient, and deeply thoughtful. He finally spoke, slowly, deliberately. "Ma'am," Judge Caprio said, "do you know why this room feels different right now?" Emily swallowed. She shook her head. "Because for the first time today," the judge continued, "this isn't about influence. It's about truth." The courtroom seemed to breathe in unison. Judge Caprio turned his attention briefly to the phone on the desk, where the governor's call had ended. "I've met powerful people in my life," he said, "and I've met ordinary people. What I've learned is this: power can open doors, but it can't close conscience." Emily's eyes filled with tears. Her posture softened. The armor she had worn since entering the room finally cracked. "My husband thought he was protecting me," she said quietly. "That's all." Judge Caprio nodded. "I believe that," he replied. "But protection doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from accountability." He leaned forward now, closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Let me ask you something, Mrs. Reynolds. If your last name wasn't Reynolds, if your husband wasn't the governor, how would you want to be treated today?" The question hit harder than any accusation. Emily hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the phone down. "I want to be treated fairly," she said, "like everyone else." Judge Caprio smiled, not triumphantly, but kindly. "That's all the law promises," he said. "Fairness, not favors." He paused, letting the words settle. "But fairness also requires honesty. And earlier today, you weren't honest, not with me, and not with yourself." Emily's shoulders shook as tears finally spilled over. "I was scared," she admitted. "I didn't want to look weak. Everyone expects me to be strong because of who he is." Judge Caprio's expression softened even further. "Strength," he said, "isn't pretending you don't need help. Strength is standing on your own feet when no one is holding you up." The room was silent except for Emily's quiet sobs. For a moment, the judge continued, "You forgot something important. This courtroom doesn't belong to politicians. It doesn't belong to titles. It belongs to people." Emily nodded slowly. "I understand that now." Judge Caprio glanced briefly toward the audience, then back to her. "Good," he said, "because today wasn't meant to embarrass you. It was meant to remind you who you are when the phone is silent and the power is gone." Emily wiped her face, taking a deep breath. "I don't want special treatment," she said. "I just want to do the right thing." Judge Caprio's smile returned, warm and approving. "That," he said, "is the first honest thing you've said today." The tension in the room finally broke, not with applause, but with understanding. What had started as a display of power had transformed into a lesson in humility. And in that moment, Emily Reynolds was no longer the governor's wife. She was simply a person, standing before a judge who believed that justice works best when everyone stands equal. The courtroom felt different now. The tension that once filled the air had softened into something quieter, heavier, but calmer. Emily Reynolds stood still, her phone lowered in her hand, no longer trembling. What had begun as an attempt to use power had ended in a lesson she would never forget. Judge Frank Caprio adjusted his glasses and looked at her steadily. There was no anger in his expression, no satisfaction in having proven a point. Only concern. He spoke not as a man in authority, but as someone who had seen this moment many times before. Emily nodded slowly, her confidence replaced by humility. For the first time, she spoke without rehearsed words or practiced defiance. She admitted that she had panicked, that fear had pushed her to reach for influence instead of responsibility. Her voice cracked as she acknowledged how wrong that choice had been. Judge Caprio listened carefully, allowing her to finish without interruption. When she did, he glanced briefly toward the bench, then back at her. He explained that the court existed not to protect status, but to protect fairness. That justice could not bend for titles, marriages, or political connections. He addressed the violation itself with clarity and balance. The fine would stand, but he reduced it, recognizing that punishment should correct behavior, not destroy dignity. He reminded her that accountability carried more weight when paired with understanding. Emily exhaled deeply, relief washing over her face. The outcome was fair, but more importantly, it was humane. She thanked the judge quietly, not as someone who had won, but as someone who had learned. In the gallery, people sat silently, absorbing what they had witnessed. This was not a dramatic victory or public humiliation. It was something rarer, a moment where authority chose wisdom over ego and correction over control. Judge Caprio looked out across the courtroom, his voice calm but firm. He spoke about how power, when misused, weakens trust, and how humility restores it. He explained that the law was strongest when it treated every person equally, regardless of who they knew or where they came from. Emily wiped her eyes, nodding again. She no longer stood as someone defined by her husband's position, but as an individual responsible for her own choices. The lesson had settled deep, far beyond the walls of that room. As the judge concluded the case, the gavel struck softly. There was no applause, no reaction louder than a breath. But the impact was undeniable. People left the courtroom knowing they had witnessed something meaningful. A reminder that justice does not need to raise its voice to be powerful. That true authority listens, and that real law is not enforced through fear or influence, but through fairness, compassion, and integrity. As the courtroom slowly emptied, a calm silence lingered in the air. What had begun as a moment of power and intimidation had ended as a lesson in humility and truth. Judge Frank Caprio remained seated for a moment, his expression peaceful, as if satisfied that justice had done more than resolve a case. It had reached a heart. The woman who had once believed influence could outweigh integrity walked out quieter than she entered. Not defeated, but changed. She had learned that authority borrowed from titles fades quickly, but respect earned through honesty lasts far longer. Her phone call, meant to control the room, had instead revealed the true strength of fairness and restraint. Judge Caprio's words echoed softly in the minds of everyone present. The law, when guided by compassion, becomes more than a system. It becomes a mirror, reflecting who we are when no power can protect us. That day, the courtroom didn't just witness a ruling. It witnessed character. For the spectators, for the officers, and for those watching from afar, the message was simple and enduring. No matter how high someone stands in society, the law stands higher, and when it is applied with kindness and wisdom, it lifts everyone. Stories like this remind us why humanity still belongs in places of judgment. They show us that justice does not need anger to be firm, nor fear to be respected. It needs truth, patience, and empathy. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you see justice a little differently, consider supporting this channel by subscribing and sharing with others. More powerful stories are waiting. Stories where unexpected moments reveal the very best of human character. Until next time, remember, real justice speaks softly, but its impact lasts forever.